Good morning and welcome to another edition of 15 Minutes of Flame. As usual, we start our proceedings off at 9/11 as a memorial, as a 9/11 memorial, but a different kind of 9/11 memorial, not the same kind of 9/11 memorial that exists every so often, where the victims and first responders are honored in a solemn moment of secular and perhaps even religious worship. No, this is a different kind of memorialization of 9/11, and that is the lie of 9/11, which to this very day permeates every single thing we do, but most importantly has given the United States government, the corporation of the United States, the military-industrial complex, and its partners license to do whatever the hell it wants all around the planet without any kind of oversight in the name of corporate control and the acquisition of resources, the destabilization of governments, and the international redistricting of countries themselves. We're going to look at some of that today, and we're going to look at what's happening in terms of both parties beginning to cannibalize themselves. This is a really interesting piece of phenomenon. But before we do all that, I want to continue to follow up on some of the threads that we began to weave together yesterday. Now, tomorrow, I promise that I'm going to put together a timeline of everything that's happened since 9/11, 2001. Now, Kathy, who's a listener of the show, said that really it all started with Columbine. I tend to think that there may be some truth with that. However, I am of the mindset that nobody died at Columbine. And maybe I'll get into that tomorrow. And perhaps we could even look at, if we want to, if we can climb down the Columbine rabbit hole a bit tomorrow, that would be interesting, of who was actually involved in Columbine and why. That's a teaser. But before we do anything else today, let us return to yesterday where I talked about the story that was unfolding in West Virginia with the warehouse story, the Dow plastics, the DuPont plastics. And Nunya Biz commented on this, and he wanted to give an update here, which is really interesting because sometimes we try to have the global perspective, but it's interesting to see what's happening regionally. I mean, clearly, we've been talking about Northern California and Santa Rosa, and we'll still continue to talk about that as long as we can, and continue to follow the threads, the updates, because we want to. This is not necessarily a sprint. We're involved in a marathon here. This is a marathon of truth. And a marathon of awakening, and it's very easy to be led around willy-nilly and go from this event to that event, and this event to that event, without, number one, being able to connect the dots, and number two, not having the ability to sustain something over a period of time so that we can really extract something meaningful from that experience, whatever it was. So here we go. This is a piece from Nunya Biz, and I'm going to read this verbatim. Latest narrative regarding the factory fire. The plastics were sold by DuPont, but stored by the owner of the old Ames plant. The owner is out of the country and has yet to comment or show his/her face in any capacity. Well, it's very convenient that this fire takes place and they're not around to have any comment or assume any level of responsibility. School is still canceled, and I expect it to be that way for at least the rest of the week. That must mean it's really bad. They have yet to thoroughly test the air around Wood County, West Virginia. They declared that the debris was non-toxic, but are not giving a confirmation whether the air is safe. The worst of it is actually hitting a small town across the river in Belpre, Ohio. The wind has carried. The wind has carried. Back here, the wind has carried a lot of smoke to their town, and some of the citizens are wearing surgical masks. There have been a few people that have gone to the hospital with respiratory issues. There are also reports of dead fish and birds in the area. Jim Justice and the commissioner, Blair Couch, whom I do not trust, held a conference in town where they effectively said nothing when they were confronted with the question, paraphrasing, there are 5 other large warehouses owned by the same person, all near residential areas. What are we going to do about them? They promptly packed up the cameras, microphones, reporters, and ended the conference. The part that is bothering me the most is that they haven't even mentioned the words arson or terrorism. The narrative with the citizens here is that it's most likely arson. I'm highly doubtful that it was a sort of spontaneous combustion because it was a 40-degree damp night in mid-Ohio Valley. Just about everyone, including non-conspiracy sorts on Facebook, believe the governor and his associates to be lying or hiding something. Regardless how it happened, the owner of the old plant warehouse is making several $1,000,000 at least. It is incredibly expensive to tear down an abandoned factory due to all the regulations and disposal techniques that are required. In fact, there are several abandoned factories in the area that just sit there because the cost would take to just remove them. Now, the owner, whoever it may be, is getting a huge insurance payout for the cleanup and is soon to be the owner of prime declared industrial land. Okay, that is disaster capitalism at its finest. Because here we have these forces that may or may not have colluded, but let's just say they did. Okay, so DuPont gets to get rid of its plastics with a fire. Okay, that's done. Maybe, I don't know what's in the other warehouses or how much plastic is in the other warehouses, but they get to get rid of those plastics. And to get rid of those plastics is not cheap. You've got to break it down. They've got to use solvents. They've got to do all these things in order to make that disposal process environmentally approved, right? So they get a cheap way to just burn the plastics and contaminate the air, kill some birds, kill some bugs, kill some fish, and damage people. And they get off. The owner of the warehouse probably does a secret handshake deal, sets up the arson, the warehouse gets burned to the ground, and as Nunya Biz has clearly stated here, that to tear down either the factory or the abandoned warehouse, which the stuff has been stored in, probably a lot of money. So instead of spending money to have that stuff torn down, this person's going to get money, and they're going to get land that is probably going to be ecologically or environmentally more intact now that the caustic structure that was there before has been eradicated. I mean, that is disaster capitalism at its finest. Now, could there be overreaching ramifications of this? Is this just a money grab in that moment? A deal with DuPont, a deal with the owner of the warehouse, a deal with the state, a deal with local city governments who may or may not actually get something as a kickback on their end? That's quite possible. Or can this be seen as part of a larger pattern of a series of events that, for all intents and purposes, could be related to some form of disaster terrorism? Think about that for just a second. We're going to cover that again tomorrow when I go through the litany and the list that I'm compiling of everything that's kind of happened since 9/11/2001, and maybe we'll go down the Columbine rabbit hole. Okay, just wanted to follow up on some of the threads here as it relates to what we've been talking about. One of the things today that really grabbed my attention is the fact, and this is kind of where we're going to focus a lot of today's 15 Minutes of Flame on, is that there is cannibalism taking place in Washington, D.C. Now, there may be actual cannibalism taking place there based on what we know about Washington, D.C., and the whole idea of cannibalism and the whole idea of things like spirit cooking and Marina Abramovich, and going all the way back to Ben Franklin and the Founding Fathers, particularly Ben Franklin and his relationship with the Hellfire Club in England, where they found a number of skeletons buried in the, well, they weren't even buried, they were just kind of stored in the deep, dank basement, the catacombs of the Hellfire Club in England, where apparently human sacrifice and more than likely some form of cannibalism was taking place. So perhaps it is true cannibalism that we could be addressing, but we're not. This is a metaphorical cannibalism that's going on in politics right now as both sides are beginning to consume themselves. This is a really fascinating phenomenon to watch, because what we're dealing with here is, maybe this all started with Jupiter and Libra, trying to find balance and the expansion of balance, and both sides getting what each side deserves. But it's pretty clear now that there's something very interesting. They're eating their own politically in Washington, D.C. on both sides. Let's start off with the top story here. That has to do with the ongoing investigation with Trump and the interference and the influence of the Russians during the 2016 election. Of course, Robert Mueller was set up as the general counsel to go after Trump. There was a lot of pressure being applied to Trump during that time. We went through this, and there is a lot of pressure being applied from a number of different sides, including inside of his own administration, with the three generals and the ejection of people like Sebastian Gorka and, of course, Jeff Bannon being at a high level, the American firsters or the Trump firsters, whatever you want to call them, the MAGAs, the head MAGAs, the magicians. They had to leave, and so there was a bit of a military kind of turnover inside the Trump White House, a military coup, which I do believe took place. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into Niger. So what's happened now is that the Comey investigation, they went after Paul Manafort. That was their guy, right? He was going to be the linchpin for all of this. Well, Paul Manafort was probably more likely involved with the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and here we go, the Podestas, okay? Because Paul Manafort is a free agent. Yes, he had some ties to Trump during the election, but Paul Manafort was involved with Russia and the Ukraine before his political affiliation with Trump during the run-up of the election. And I think once the Trump team sniffed around Manafort and found out that he, number one, had ties to the Clintons, and number two, had he probably even deeper ties to his business associates in Russia and the Ukraine, they decided to take him off the election team. And there was the sort of the merry-go-round and the replacement process. Corey Lewandowski was in there, but ultimately it came down to Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon, who helped Trump become elected in what we would think was a fair and sound electoral process, which I believe it was, because everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide. And of course, even the most sophisticated metrics and demographics, psychographics, proved to be factually wrong. So Manafort now apparently is probably starting to sing like a canary, because now the investigation is turning towards John Podesta's brother, Tony Podesta, and the Podesta Group, which is really John and Tony, and their relationship with Paul Manafort, and their relationship with Russia, and their relationship with the Ukraine, their relationship with Putin, and their relationship with the Clinton regime and the Obama administration. So this is a major pivot that's taking place inside of the Mueller investigations. Now, my sense is I can't make this correlate to anything, but my sense is that the Mueller team was finding a lot of dead ends when it came to Trump being influenced by the Russians during the election. Okay. There were a lot of dead ends taking place. And if you go back and you recall, Van Jones said it's a big nothing burger, which it is. It's a big nothing burger. Now, there are other people out there that will say that that's wrong and correct, that the Russian influence is deeply connected to Trump. If you want to watch a really good movie around this from a metaphorical level, watch No Way Out with Kevin Costner and Gene Hackman. It's one of the classic kind of Washington, D.C. thrillers that takes place inside the Pentagon. And Kevin Costner plays an American soldier. He's like a colonel or major or something like that. Captain. He's not a plebe. He's in the Navy. Anyway, it's worth watching. And there are lots of different levels, and it gives you kind of an idea as to how different governments embed themselves in our government. Anyway, it's a bit of a tangent. But so now what's happened is Paul Manafort has found these different cul-de-sacs, and he can't come up empty-handed. I'm sorry, Mueller has found all these different cul-de-sacs, and he can't come up empty-handed. He's got to come up with something. Now, the other thing, too, is that, keep this in mind, that Mueller was involved with Hillary Clinton, and there are stories of Mueller actually going to Russia and passing off samples of uranium. He may have actually been a bagman. So perhaps another layer of this is Mueller is trying to cover his ass. So whatever is going to come out of this grand jury that was set up, which may be just a complete and utter fail in terms of what they were supposed to find and how it's ultimately going to ricochet, boomerang, and come back on the people who thought they could find enough dirt on Trump to kick him out. This thing could be one of the greatest fails in modern political history, because there's another theory that it was all set up so that Mueller could get in there with his people and begin to cover their tracks, because they're the ones that had the relationship with Uranium One and some of the smaller companies that were involved in the lobbying and the distribution of money and funds and all that. But ultimately, if Mueller decides that he wants to cover his ass and save his ass, he will go downstream and he'll pick off the Podestas. He'll pick off Hillary Clinton. He'll pick off all the people that he needs to do in order to keep his ass out of the limelight and ultimately out of prison. This is going to be very interesting to watch over the course of the next few weeks. Now remember, from an astrological perspective, we're still in the Saturn Sagittarius phase. And also keep in mind that we're going to see Venus in sextile with Saturn as it moves forward in Libra. That's the scales of justice. It's the relationship of the scales of justice. And it will be in sextile before Saturn moves out of Sagittarius with Saturn. This is a very interesting astrological development. So will we see actual true justice being served during the last degrees of Saturn in Sagittarius? And remember that 27th and 28th degree of a sign is the most volatile degree of the sign, because it is getting ready to leave that sign and go into a state of inertia, or the inert 29th degree, where it is just flatlined and getting ready to become renewed at the next sign in the 0 degree point. So really what you want to look at is December. Now I know a lot of times things get shut down in December. Government gets shut down. Everything gets shut down except for businesses in general, right? People wanting to sell new shit for Christmas and all that stuff. Well, just keep in mind that this could be a very interesting time where truth or information that is really juicy, and we get to see kind of the underbelly of all the stuff, can be revealed, and then it can be buried, because now we're in the holiday cycle. That's where we are with Saturn and Sagittarius at those final degrees. It's happening right around the holiday season. So just keep that in mind, bear that in mind. So what we're seeing now, just in that investigation alone, is all of a sudden Mueller, who's been hired theoretically by the left and by the progressives and by the globalists and the neoliberals, the socialists, whatever group you want to kind of put into that amalgamation, he's beginning to consume them. He's beginning to eat themselves. Look on the Republican side of things. What's happening there? You've got people like Bob Corker. You've got people like Jeff Flake and John McCain. And these are Republicans in name only. Mitch McConnell, Republican in name only. And what's happening now is that there is, again, this kind of more aggressive roots version of the Republican Party that is going after these guys. And they, in turn, are on the attack mode, and they're going after them because they are realizing that their lifeline, the feeding tube at the public trough, is really about to become threatened, and they themselves are almost extinct. John Corker and Jeff Flake will not be running for re-election. I don't know what John McCain's story is. I mean, he may be just completely soul scalped at this point, and there's nobody in there except some alien who's kind of, running the program and moving the levers and pressing the buttons in whatever remains of John McCain's controlled Manchurian candidate mind. So what we're seeing, even inside the Republican Party, there is a bit of a revolution. And they in turn, from the rhino side, are eating their own, right? And then you have sort of this kind of new breed of the Republican, which is much more sort of even more radical than Tea Party 1.0, Tea Party 2.0. I tell you right now, when it happens, it's going to be even more intense, even more strident than Tea Party 1.0. So we can see both parties are starting to consume themselves. It's a really, really fascinating phenomenon to watch, just to sit back and watch the Ouroboros in effect. Emily Moyer, who has been, I've been on Emily's show with Randy, Off Planet Radio, a number of times. It's a great show, by the way. If you haven't subscribed to it on YouTube, I highly recommend it. They do an incredible job. They cover so much ground, so much territory, and they're starting to really want to build this out in a way that is legitimate. I'm not saying that they're not legitimate now, but in a way where they can become kind of a greater and more agnostic voice in a lot of ways. Because what you'll get with Off Planet Radio is you'll get views that are really unfiltered, right, uncut, unlike other formats, other stations, other platforms, other websites, other podcast streams, whatever. Randy and Emily don't have an agenda. The only agenda they have is to explore the fringe and uncover truth. That's it. So if you haven't subscribed to them, I highly recommend you do that. And one of the things that Emily said recently on one of the shows is that everything is exactly what it is and what it needs to be. That it doesn't have to be any kind of, is there a cause for alarm? Well, to some extent there is, right? I mean, can we kind of move things along through psychic, spiritual, and emotional momentum? Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to share some of this a little bit later in the show. But do we have to be completely and utterly freaked out because these things are happening? Well, we need to be aware of what's happening, and we also need to be aware that there are, guess what, consequences. There are consequences. These things cannot happen in a void anymore. They can't. And even though the mainstream media will all of a sudden look at their watch and say, time's up on Las Vegas, we're going to stop talking about it, we're not. Other people are not. There's a whole different media stream that's going on and taking place right now that people are really tuned into and dialed into. Let me give you an example. Recently, there was an article on NFL.com, I believe, or CBSSports.com, one of the two. I think it's CBS. And there's a writer named Jason La Canfora. And Jason La Canfora was talking about why people are not watching the NFL as much anymore. And the NFL was a lockdown, ratings, glamour girl. That's what it was. It was a ratings queen. That's what, anytime the NFL was on, even the worst NFL game would outrank the best baseball game. Okay? That's no longer the case anymore, by the way. So he's building his own case about why the NFL is losing ratings. And at not one point does La Canfora really talk about the major disconnect between the American public and how these athletes are being perceived. He doesn't address that at all. Glosses over it. He comes up with this statistic and that statistic, and he talks about millennials and fantasy football. And yeah, that probably contributes to some of it. But if you really want to drill down and understand what's going on, go right to the comments of that piece. Every single comment in that piece is basically refuting everything that La Canfora says. And the comments are, 350, 400 comments deep. And 95% of them are calling bullshit on La Canfora and his essentially covering up for the NFL and the mainstream media. See, this is what's happening. I'm just using this as an example because the platforms are out there and they're completely one-directional, right? They're monodirectional, just going in one direction. I'll give you another example. I was watching Doug Baldwin, who plays for the Seattle Seahawks, and he got into a shoving match with a coach on the sidelines during the game last Sunday. And Doug Baldwin has been at the forefront of football and politics and activism, and Doug is a smart guy. He went to Stanford. He's just a really, really smart guy. He's bright. He's thoughtful, and he's a wide receiver. And he lost his cool. He absolutely lost his cool and went after his coach. So what happened? Why did he do that? Well, they had a press conference after the game where he essentially was going to cop to the fact that he had, lost his cool. And one of the things that Doug Baldwin says is that he was frustrated, and he was about to say that I was frustrated with the NFL, and he was going to say frustrated with the NFL. Frustrated with the NFL. But he caught himself, and then he brought it back to his team. Now, what's really fascinating about this little snippet here that Baldwin brought up is that really he was frustrated at the NFL, and he was taking it out on his coach, right? Because his coach was in that moment a symbol of authority. His coach happens to be white. I don't know if he would have done it if his coach was black. I don't know. He just happened to be white coach, but he was a symbol of authority. So he, in my estimation, he was taking his frustration in the NFL out on Tom Cable. Now, what's fascinating about this is I probably watch too much football coverage. But when I was watching this, I said to myself, how come none of the football announcers or pundits are addressing the fact that he almost said NFL? It's like that's just going beyond it's beyond their pay grade in some ways. I would have been all over it. I would have said, hey, he almost said he's frustrated at the NFL. Is this part and parcel of Doug Baldwin's activism? Is his anger being activated to the point where it's spilling over into the game? But no, they didn't do that. And I'm sharing this with you because this is generally how the mainstream media operates. Unless it is within the realm of their talking points, they are prone to a kind of a social catatonia. Really, they're so slow. It's really amazing. So that's just it in a microcosm. In the macrocosm, it has to do everything with them determining when it is time to stop talking about something. And clearly, this is what's happened with Las Vegas. You won't hear anything about what's happening in Northern California. But the cannibalism still continues. And it's fascinating to watch. Here's another example of it. Kathy Griffin, who displayed the severed head, the bloody severed head of Donald Trump. Well, she was represented by Lisa Bloom, who is a the daughter of Gloria Allred. And Lisa Bloom has sort of taken up Gloria Allred's, she's taken up her banner that she's going to represent women who are abused, women who have been objectified, women who, whatever's happened with women in a way that has caused them to suffer some form of either monetary, physical, psychic, or emotional duress. She is going to be there. She's an ambulance chaser in many regards, like her mother. So she was there for Kathy Griffin, and apparently it came out that that Lisa Bloom, who was also involved in the Weinstein case, there was an email that was leaked, and Lisa Bloom apparently was going to discredit some of the women who were coming forward and bringing evidence or their own testimony to the Weinstein affair. So all of a sudden, Lisa Bloom's credibility has become completely undermined. Now, Kathy Griffin wants her money back because she believes that Lisa Bloom did not represent her in a way that Lisa Bloom said she would represent her. So Kathy Griffin wants her money back, and they've been going through this Twitter war. And now Lisa Bloom is complaining that Kathy Griffin went off script during the press conference and basically blew any chance of Lisa being able to represent her in a way that Kathy would have felt good about, that Kathy would have benefited from. So here we go. They're eating their own, right? So there's this kind of social cannibalism that's taking place. We are in the realm of the Ouroboros, which, by the way, is a very scorpionic kind of symbol if you think about it, because it's the snake, right? It's the snake that's consuming its tail. And when we think of Scorpio, we think about scorpions, but also the snake is a very prevalent image. Snakes, dragons, reptiles, these are all very scorpionic images for a number of different reasons. Most of which with the snake is that they get to shed their skin, which is a very scorpionic kind of act, right? Death, rebirth, you shed the skin. There's an old part of you, there's a new part of you. But also Scorpio represents sex, vitality, kundalini. And Scorpio, of course, is known for that. So perhaps this Jupiter Scorpio moment in time is the amplification of the Ouroboros consuming its own tail. Very interesting to sit back and watch, by the way. I mean, you just get the popcorn and watch it all unfold. Really fascinating. Utterly fascinating. What's not so fascinating is another involvement in a foreign conflict and war, and that's the American conflict in Niger, which is now beginning to rear its ugly head. I mean, let's be clear about this. Every war now has nothing at all to do with liberation or the spreading of democracy or any of that other puerile bullshit that they want to shove down our throats. What it has to do is the acquisition of resources. The acquisition of resources. So I'm going to read you a little bit here. This is from Stephen Lendman, stephenlendman.org. What's going on in Niger. So I'm going to just read this to you. It's not very long. It says, few Americans know anything about the country. They're minimally knowledgeable geographically about nations. Only when Washington goes to war. Testimony to public ignorance. A national disgrace in a nation where it's simple to stay informed by following reliable independent online sources. Niger is landlocked in central northwest Africa, nearly twice the size of France territorially. It is the world's fifth largest source of uranium. It's the fourth largest producer, reason enough for America's presence. Its other valued resources include coal, iron, ore, tin, phosphates, gold, molybdenum, gypsum, salt, and oil. With at least 40 billion barrels of proved reserves, perhaps multiples this amount, it's believed, along with plentiful natural gas. Niger became newsworthy with reports of militants killing 4 U.S. Special Forces, the Pentagon saying little about what happened. It failed to explain why around 800 U.S. troops are based in the country. Congressional members not told earlier Trump likely didn't know. What are they doing there? value Niger resources alone explain it. In October 5th, 2015, America and Niger agreed to cooperate in combating terrorism. The U.S. supports. Green Berets were deployed to the nation. On February 5, Washington sought permission to build a drone base in the country. The Nigerian President Mahamadou Issoufou approved a Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, legitimizing America's presence, a deplorable arrangement denying host countries jurisdiction over U.S. military and civilian personnel. So he basically handed the military over to the United States and Niger. They prevent them from enforcing their laws against crimes committed by U.S. personnel, unacceptable noise, pollution, environmental contamination, and use of valued public land. Construction of a second drone base is underway in Agadez. Construction completion expected next year. Niger is key for America's planned expanded presence on the continent, a Northwest African regional hub. Now, keep in mind that the Chinese have been in Africa for well over the last decade. I began to write about this and talk about this at around 2009, 2010, when China was building cities in Africa. China was moving troops into Africa. They were buying mines in Africa, and they were even kicking out the local African population who'd worked the mines for actual Chinese workers in the mines themselves. And of course, one of the biggest resources in Africa is coltan. And coltan is the thing that they use in the chip in your cell phone. The Pentagon operates an airbase near Niamey, Niger's capital and largest city. Its population about 1.3 million. U.S. military operations in the country are kept under wraps. 4 U.S. Special Forces killed in Niger is a convenient pretext for expanding America's military presence in the nation and on continent, claiming it to combat the terrorism that Washington supports. U.S. forces in Africa are all about controlling and carving up the continent for profit, preventing China and Russia from gaining a greater foothold than already, a modern-day great game. Yeah, Russia and China's building trains, man. They're building trains throughout Africa so that they can move their product out of Africa to ships that will bring it back to China. So Africa is right in the crosshairs of a geopolitical struggle and battle for the resources, huge amounts of resources on that continent. America's military operates in nearly all African countries. It's called AFRICOM. Some more important than others. Most troops at Camp Lemonnier at AFRICOM's Djibouti headquarters in the continent's northeast horn. According to Tom Dispatch, TD, highly classified AFRICOM files obtained via the Freedom of Information Act offer clear evidence of the Pentagon's continental reach. U.S. military facilities in at least 46 of Africa's 54 countries, perhaps more not yet disclosed. They're integral to expanding U.S. military operations on the African continent and in the Middle East, said TD, waging a phony war on terror, the pretext used to justify their presence expanding at a rapid pace. Wherever U.S. troops show up, violence and destabilization follow. This is true. Entire countries and regions are harmed, some devastated like the Middle East, Central Africa, Central Asia, and North Africa. Part of Washington's aim for unchallenged global dominance, no matter the human cost. One of the interesting movies that came out of the 70s was a film called 3 Days of the Condor that stars Robert Redford and Cliff Robertson. And in that movie, Robert Redford plays an employee of the CIA who is really involved in some form of research, reading newspapers, books. He's an intellectual. He is not a field operative. He is not a field agent. And his office in Washington, D.C. is completely wiped out in a hit because of some very classified information, highly classified information that came across the intercept there. And what happens over the course of the film is Robert Redford begins to use his mind, his intellect, all of his brainy skills in order to not only stay out of reach of the CIA that wants to bring him in and take him down, because he may know what was being transmitted through code through that hub. But he also turns the tables on them in a very interesting kind of way. It's a fascinating movie, and the guy who's kind of behind the scenes on the CAI side, running a rogue operation, is Cliff Robertson. And what he says in the end of the movie, he says, "You really don't get it. You know, you're too idealistic. You know, whether it's oil or food or water, whatever it is, if the American people need it, they will look in the other direction and they'll beg us to go to these places and acquire these resources by any means necessary." So this is kind of the operative theme that takes place, you know, through the CIA, through the military-industrial complex. Because, at the end of the day, it is a war and a battle for resources. That's what it's all about. And any of this other bullshit, unless, of course, it's redrawing the map for Greater Israel in the Middle East, it's all really just a bunch of propaganda, hype, and hooey. That's what it all amounts to. So Niger is the next place. Africa is the next Middle East. And what do? We sit back, we look at it, we watch, we become aware. And what's really mind-blowing to me is where are we know that the Republicans, they're a war party. More resources, more security, whatever it is, just sign off on it, sign off on that military budget. They don't get a free pass because really they should be waking up too, theoretically. But on the Democratic side, we talked about this the other day, where's the outrage? Where is the outrage? Where is the outrage for war been for a long time? Even in the Obama administration, that drone Thursday, the deaths under Obama in Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East, and to some extent even North Africa, were huge, and nobody said a peep. You know, but if that happens, and they're not even really talking about it with Trump either. They're just going after his character or whatever perceived malfunction is currently taking place in Trump's life, whether it's his mind or his wife or through his kids, whatever it is. But they're not going after these core issues, which is the expansion of the military-industrial complex and the impact and effect that it has on our people here in this country and other people in other countries as well. They clearly missed the boat on that. And it's unfortunate because the Democrats used to be the anti-war party. Go back to the 60s, that's what they stood up for. They've completely abandoned that. They've abandoned it for identity politics and a different kind of war. Lastly today, I want to leave you with a story that is slightly depressing and yet at the same time is really important to take note of. This came through October 25th, today. Website Fellowship of the Minds. There has been a man by the name of Philip R. A-H-R, who is 66 years old, and he was elected to the Radnor Township Board of Commissioners and served as the board's president until October 23rd, 12 days after his arrest for personal reasons. Can you guess what those personal reasons are? They found huge amounts of child porn in this guy's computer. I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs here. It says, in a press release, Delaware County District Attorney John J. Whalen said, during the search of R's home on September 21st, a desktop and laptop computer were confiscated. A forensic examination of the hard drives was conducted by Detective Chris Tanklowitz, which recovered video and numerous graphic images depicting children engaged in sex acts, including one image that depicted a female child, approximately 3 to 5 years old, performing oral sex on an adult male. Detectives also located numerous chat logs between R and individuals dating back to 2013, in which R shared and sought graphic images and videos of children in sexual positions, bondage, and engaged in sex acts with adults. I'm not going to read you any more. It is pretty bad. Anyway, I'm just sharing this with you because the rabbit hole is getting deeper and deeper and deeper now. And what's happening, or what will happen with guys like Philip R., who's probably a low-level child porn operative, is that they will start to talk. They'll start to say, they'll look at what's on their hard drive, they'll look at who it went to, who it came from, and guess what? They will widen the search. They will widen the web. Right? The web of absolute and utter corruption, and not just corruption, but the desecration of youth and innocence. This is a very interesting development, extremely interesting development. And you, again, look at what's happening with Harvey Weinstein. And now James Toback, whom I actually interviewed at one point in time, he's got now, 38 women have come forward and accused him of sexual misconduct. Maybe we'll talk about that some other time in another show. Maybe I'll even play the Toback interview. That might be interesting. Anyway, again, there's this Ouroboros effect starting to take place. And when these people who are being arrested begin to come forward with other evidence, because these guys don't want to go to prison. I mean, prison will be a living hell for Philip R. I mean, absolute living hell, because we know what they do to child molesters in prison. It is not pretty. Why? Because most of the men in prison have been molested themselves, and it's their way to get back at their molesters. That's really the bottom line, kind of fundamental and dark law of the jungle. Anyway, I don't want to leave you with so much darkness today, because what's happening as we go through this, we're cycling back and we're moving towards the light. This is what's happening. This is the reclamation of the light in our culture, in our society. You know, I talked about many years ago an endarkenment. Before enlightenment, there is endarkenment. And this is what's taking place now. And we're at a moment in time where the old Pizzagate began to open us up to this kind of, well, it was pre-Pizzagate. I mean, obviously, if you were paying any attention to the Penn State scandal, Jimmy Savile, that was really the beginning of it. But we have been now slowly indoctrinated into this idea of what's going on behind the scenes, behind the curtains, behind closed doors, in ways that we couldn't even imagine 25, 30 years ago, were the people that were doing it, perpetrated, because they all appear to be pillars of society, involved in local government, local churches, local sports groups, whatever they are, which are just really just covers for them, and allow them to operate in a greater field of predation. So the light is coming through. We are reclaiming the light. This is not necessarily the cul-de-sac or the end game. Yes, it's a dark commentary on our society and what's been going on for a very long time. But it's in our way a process of reclaiming the light, which might even be related to Jupiter and Scorpio. Again, as we expand and deepen the nature of that aspect of astrology. Speaking of astrology, again, I have my webinar coming up. You can go to astrolata.com and check it out. I'm doing a 3-hour webinar on Saturday on Saturn and Capricorn. That's going to be a big one. You don't want to miss it, really, because it's going to be chock full of information. We're going to go all through Saturn. We're going to go all through Capricorn. We're going to look at the last cycle. We're going to look at it through each sign. It'll be a juicy one. Also, you still have, what's today? Tuesday? Wednesday. Today's Wednesday, right? So you still have today, tomorrow, and Friday to sign up for the everything reading on my site. It's normally a $287 2-hour reading. I combine your natal chart with transits, the draconic chart, your numbers, your major arcana, and the Mayan dream spell. So you get all of that. It's a 2-hour reading. I've taken $50 off of that. So it's actually $237 for a 2-hour really in-depth reading. So if you ever wanted to go deep on something through my website, in my work, that's an opportunity for you to do that. And that's good till Friday. And that's about it in terms of all that goodness. So you know the drill. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to say what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you tomorrow. Kind of felt like Rick from Rick and Morty for a second there. I'll see you tomorrow for another edition of 15 Minutes of Flame.